Hi, I'm Heather, and I have a video for you showing how I did some no-line watercolor with one of the new stamps from Penny Black's Making Spirits Bright collection. I added some liquid frisket or masking fluid to a piece of cold-pressed watercolor paper before I started and made sure that was dry before I did anything else. I'm using soft stone ink from Papertrey ink to stamp the pale image that I'll use for the no-line watercolor. And the name of the Penny Black stamp is Carmine, and it's a lovely poinsettia image. The softstone ink is a pale grey, and I find that it's really good for no-line watercolor. It really blends and fades into the images I paint. I'm adding most of my colour with watercolor paints. These are Sennelier watercolors, and I'm just adding a little bit of water first and then mixing my first color, which is going to be a pinky red. I'm using some of the pink with a little bit of the red to make my own color. I tend to find that's a good idea to mix a color rather than use a straight color, because that way I can vary it. If I want a little bit of difference between my petals, I can add a little more pink to some, I can add a little more red to others, and it just makes it easier to get that nice realistic variation. The way I'm going to do these petals is to paint a little bit of dark paint close to the center of the flower and then wash my brush out and bring just a damp brush with a little bit of water in it to blend that paint to the end of the petal. So the ends will be lighter than the beginnings of the petals, those beginnings which are close to the center. When you're adding water or more paint to an area that you've already started painting, you have to be careful not to add paint that is quite wet to an area that's already started to dry, and that's what's happened in one of these petals here. I added more paint in and it was wetter than the paper, and so it made a watercolor bloom. All I did was dry off my brush and just blend over the top of that to even things out and spread the paint and water. So the process for all these petals is the same. I use a bolder, darker paint at the beginning and then either switch to another clean brush or just wash my brush and blend that paint out with a damp brush. I've sped up the footage here so that you can see a few more of the petals as I work on them, but much faster. Once I've got that petal filled with color, I often get a little bit of the bolder color and drop it in back where I started, right close to the center, just to make it even bolder there. And then the blend goes out to pale. You can see I flip around from one flower to the other and making sure that I'm not painting petals adjacent to petals that were just painted. So I don't want to start painting next to a petal that's still wet. One thing that you can do is just dry them as you complete them, or you can just make sure that you move on to a petal in another area of the flower to give the first ones a chance to dry. as always, I keep a paper towel handy in case I add too much paint, or in this case, I painted next to an area that was still wet. So immediately I dabbed out that paint to make sure it didn't spread into the petal next door. Now, when the tip of a petal is behind one of the other petals, I sometimes add a little more color to that too, to show that it's being shadowed by the petal on top. As I start the green petals, I mix a new green, once again with a bluey green and some of the more olivey yellow green. And then I'm going to use exactly the same technique. I'm going to paint that bit of the leaf that is close to the center of the flower. That's going to be my darkest part, just adding a little bit of paint. You can see I'm only painting maybe a quarter of the leaf at a time, and then switching brushes or washing my brush and dabbing it on the edge of my water jar to make sure I'm not carrying over too much water, and then using that brush to blend the paint in the leaf right to the end. So I should have a darker side and a lighter side. If you find that even the lighter side of your leaf or petal is too dark, again, you can pull some out with a thirsty brush, a brush that has been cleaned and dabbed on a paper towel, or you can pull some paint out with your paper towel. Another way to darken one part of your leaf is to actually use a little bit of red. Red is the contrasting color to green, so you can use a little bit of red in your green to just darken it a bit and give it a little bit of a brown tone. On this petal that I'm working on now, I'm using exactly the same technique, starting with less diluted color, blending it out with water right to the tip. But on this tip, I'm going to add a little bit of green in, because when you look at a poinsettia, sometimes some of those petals have a little bit of green and red in them. So I'm just using some of the green from the leaves to dab into the end or drop into the end, and then blending it back into the rest of the petal. Switching over to the berries now, and I'm using that same red that I was using for the petals, but I'm adding some burgundy to it. So it's not going to clash with what I've already painted, but it's definitely going to be a different color, a darker color, and I'm going to paint these little berries. My aim is to paint half of each berry and then blend out the other side. So I've got, again, a dark side and a light side. You could definitely do your no-line watercolor with dye inks. If you wanted to, you could just smush them onto a piece of acrylic, an acrylic block or a glass mat, and then pick up your ink from there if you don't have watercolor paints. You could even scribble dye water-soluble markers onto an acrylic block and pick up your ink from there. I use all those methods, but I love to use my paints occasionally. I just really like the look from the watercolor paints. I added a little bit of brown to the red paint that I was using to do the stems. You could use straight brown or you could use a brown marker, or if you've still got it in your, if you've still got the stamp in your stamp positioner, you could just ink those stems and stamp them with brown. I just decided to keep on going with the paint. For the leaves that are on the berry stems, I've made my green a little bit brighter, still working with that same green but added more blue to it. So it's a more bluey green, it's a little bit brighter, but same method again, adding paint to one side of the leaf or one end of the leaf and then blending that paint to fill the whole leaf. And ending up with a lighter side, just ending up with more interest and definition to the leaf. A little bit more shadow and dimension. Before I finish those brighter leaves, I'm just going to paint the centers of the poinsettias, and I've added some yellow to the green, so I've got a real kind of pale mustardy green to fill those centers. And then I've dried that, and I'm going to ink the centers because there's a lot of definition, little circles in the center of the flowers. I'm going to ink them with a forest moss distress marker and stamp over the top, and that'll give me the shape of those little circles in the middle of the flowers. So even though that was the only thing that I stamped again after the initial stamping, it was worth keeping my panel in the stamp positioner just to do that, because it's much easier to do those little lines with the marker than to try and paint them. After I'd finished painting all the leaves, I dried the panel and took it out of the positioner so I could blend a background. I started blending speckled egg ink, but as you can see, the brush still had some weathered wood ink in it, so that's why that corner is very grey. I kept blending anyway, and you'll see that it starts looking more of the blue of speckled egg. So I just kept on going, and then the next time I inked the brush, I was able to pick up more speckled egg ink, so it looks much bluer without that grey. I added it all around, not worrying too much if I overlapped with the painting, because speckled egg is quite a pale colour, so I wasn't really changing much there. With all that blended ink, I did add some splatters of water, which would make some watermarks once I dab them up with a paper towel. When it was dry, I removed all the masking fluid to reveal all the little white dots and added a sentiment from the Penny Black Thrill of Hope set in versafine Clair Morning Mist ink. Thanks for joining me today. Make sure you check out my blog for more details and a complete supply list. I'll see you again soon.